During World War II, about 120,000 Japanese Americans were sent to relocation camps because of a document called Executive Order 9066. Two-thirds of the Japanese Americans lived on the West Coast, but they were put in internment camps further in the country. President Franklin D. Roosevelt stated that all Japanese Americans were considered threats and needed to be locked up. This is the story of how Executive Order 9066 affected the lives of thousands of Japanese Americans living in America. The story starts in late 1931 when Japan would invade Manchuria, a northern part of China, because of the Mukden incident. The Mukden incident, which was most likely staged by the Japanese, was when Chinese personnel supposedly planted explosives near a Japanese railway. 6 years later, in 1937, Japan would go on and invade China again for natural resources like coal and iron ore. They bombed cities like Shanghai and Nanjing, their capital at that time. World War II started on September 1st, 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, which caused the United Kingdom and France to declare war on Germany. 1 year later, on September 27, 1940, the Tri-Party Pact was formed between Germany, Italy, and Japan. About a year later, Japan controlled most of eastern China, French Indochina, and a lot of the Pacific theater. Throughout the war, the United States had been supplying Britain, so Japan had a plan. They would bomb one of the United States' biggest ports to significantly weaken the U.S. Navy. On December 7, 1941, Japan would launch an airstrike over Pearl Harbor, killing 2,400 people and weakening the U.S. Navy massively. The next day, Franklin D. Roosevelt would state his Day in Infamy speech.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
The day after the Pearl Harbor bombings, the United States declared war on Japan, and 3 days later, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which stated that all people of Japanese descent in the United States would be put into relocation camps. About two-thirds of Japanese Americans lived on the West Coast, but they were moved further into the country. At the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, about 120,000 persons of Japanese ancestry lived on the U.S. mainland, mostly along the Pacific coast. About two-thirds were full citizens, born and raised in the United States. Following the Pearl Harbor attack, however, a wave of anti-Japanese suspicion and fear led the Roosevelt administration to adopt a drastic policy towards these residents, aliens and citizens alike. Virtually all Japanese Americans were forced to leave their homes and property and live in camps for most of the war. On the same day of the Pearl Harbor attack, the FBI and local police raided houses of Japanese aliens if they were thought to be suspicious. 120,000 people were put in internment camps, 70,000 being U.S. citizens. The thing was that most of them were just innocent citizens that were trying to live their lives. But it wouldn't stop taking effect until 1976. Multiple artifacts came from these internment camps, like a letter written by Helen and Misao Kawazuye in 1942. We received your card many weeks ago, and we're awful glad to hear from you. I meant to answer it sooner, but have been quite busy trying to straighten up our room, etc. Hoping when this letter reaches you, you are both fine and dandy. How is your son? Hope he is fine and dandy too. They make small talk, talking about the weather and apologizing that they couldn't keep in touch. They also did not mention the injustices towards them until 1944, when they were finally released. There was another letter written by T. Ferry to someone named Norio in mid-1942. On this first Memorial Day after our fateful entrance into a frightening, devastating war. There was nothing in this camp to remind us of that occasion except a memorial service this evening at 7. No military parade will we see. No valiant, half-hearted display of armed might. The letter we just looked at was a part of a newspaper called the Manzanar Free Press, located at the Manzanar internment camp, located in the middle of California, where 11,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated. It was called What the World is Saying, quoting the newspaper letters concerning Japanese American internment. There was also an instruction sheet on repatriation, which is to send someone back to their home country. All residents of the center that desire to request repatriation to Japan should call at the center manager's office immediately so the necessary forms may be filled out and completed prior to Friday, July 24th, 1942. The thing is that the internees that signed up were put into the Two Lake internment camp, located all the way north of California. It was a very harsh place to be, having poor sanitary conditions, a prison-like environment, and very limited privacy. Two Lake was one of the 10 camps operated by the WRA from May 27, 1942 to March 20th, 1946. The period of Japanese American incarceration where 110,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly removed from their homes and communities and incarcerated. WRA facilities included 144 administration and support buildings. A prison-like atmosphere and lack of freedom was apparent. Two Lake was also the primary site where 6,000 Japanese Americans renounced their U.S. citizenship. Peaking at about 18,700 people, it was the last WRA camp to close, closing 7 months after World War II ended in May of 1946. It was also the worst camp out of the 10. People were put here if they were seen as disloyal. The people who did make it out alive were excluded by society. In 1944, President Franklin Roosevelt unofficially revoked the terms of Executive Order 9066, letting many Japanese Americans go home. A month after the nuking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered to the Allies and World War II ended. Most internment camps were shut down, but the Two Lake internment camp didn't end until 7 months after World War II. It took about 31 years for Executive Order 9066 to formally end. On February 19, 1976, Gerald Ford officially resigned Executive Order 9066 and apologized, saying, "This kind of error will never be made again."